course, off we set. And it was a mixed experience. I mean, they were nice people, but they spoke Dutch, not English. Things weren't working out. So someone said, why don't we go to this place called the New World? Well, sure enough, eventually we set off a few weeks ago. It's been some journey just to get here. Just about to set off from Plymouth, no idea what's ahead of us. A mixture of hope and trepidation, but hopefully the good Lord will provide for us. Sorry, just one moment. What? It's not 1620, it's 2021. So these people know if we got there or not. Oh, I'm sorry about that. Actually, I'm not. This is such a human story. It's people like you and I caught up in events. Some happen near us, some way, way back. Two big events happened more than 100 years before the Mayflower that led to what happened and eventually going on that ship. Like all good stories, there's a before, a during, and an after. And the unexpected. We'll find that it wasn't just the Mayflower that left, there was another ship. It wasn't just religious pilgrims on the ship, there are other people there. And you can see behind me a painting. I've done more and more of these. You know, they say a picture paints 1,000 words. I use various paintings, hopefully, to bring things to life. So if you're sitting comfortably, then we'll begin. And what I'm going to do is show you a video at first of the Mayflower, which hopefully helps you get a bit of a feel for what it was like, both the ship, the voyage, and the people on it. And if someone gives me a thumbs up if they see the video working, that would be reassuring. It must have been a dreadful voyage. 2 miles an hour, and that's half of our normal walking speed. You know, over 2 months, and no technology that told you we'll be there tomorrow. You'd wake up each morning wondering. So, some experience. What I'm now going to do is a slide presentation. So again, I'll go back into share screen, and that worked quite well. So hopefully that's a good sign for the future. All right, you can all see the screen there, can you? Good. So let's plunge straight away back into time and what was happening in those times, the Reformation. But I find the Reformation is one of those words we remember from school history, but we know much more depends. But here's Europe in the 16th century. And we can see England and Scotland are the same countries as now, but there was no United Kingdom. France was a country, but the border wasn't quite the same. There was no Germany then, there was just a German empire. What we now know of as Belgium and Holland weren't countries. They were 17 provinces, the Netherlands or Low Countries. In fact, the Spanish Netherlands, because they were ruled from Spain. Now, the most powerful country there for religion was Italy. Most of Europe was Catholic, and not just Catholic, but Roman Catholic, controlled by the Pope down in Rome. The most powerful country was Spain, which, as I already mentioned, it also ruled the Netherlands. During the century, it brought back wealth from South America and was a very powerful country. Now, I mentioned two big events happened more than 100 years before the Mayflower. And the first big one was 1492, Christopher Columbus discovered the New World. And rather like they say, when he went, he didn't know where he was going. When he got there, he didn't know where he was. And when he came back, he didn't know where he'd been. So they just called it the New World. I don't know about you growing up, I'd always assumed Columbus was British, but no, he was actually Italian, but he was paid for by the Spanish government, did the exploration. But then, if you like, would eventually provide the pull for the pilgrims to go across to the New World. Now, I mentioned Spain. Charles V was the king for most of the first half of the century, one of the most powerful monarchs in history. Quite similar in England. They had Henry VIII was king for almost 40 years. And what happened with religion was, well, the second big event was 1517. Martin Luther nailed up 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, protesting about some of the Catholic practices. For example, if you'd been a naughty boy or girl and sinned, you could say you were sorry, say some Hail Marys, and you could buy what was called an indulgence. And that gave you permission to be forgiven and perhaps get back into the kingdom of heaven. Luther thought this was wrong, and his ideas gradually spread. Even more powerful than him was John Calvin, who set himself up down in Geneva, very much behind the Puritan way of thinking, and gradually their ideas spread throughout Europe. Some countries changed to be Protestant, some stayed the same. Now, very crucial, if you were a Catholic in a Protestant country or a Protestant in a Catholic country, you would be persecuted. And in the Spanish Netherlands, the Spanish they reckon the Spanish killed 50 to 100,000 people. And so naturally, people fled from there. So a lot of the refugees came across to England, and Henry allowed them to stay. Now, John Knox, I'm sure you all know the name. So, of course, he's from Scotland. Now, quite interesting, he actually was in the Church of England for many years. Before Mary became queen, took England to be Catholic again, Bloody Mary as she's called, and people like Knox had to flee out of England, and he went down to Calvin in Geneva. And as you know, very quickly, when Elizabeth was king, he went back to Scotland, and in 1560, fairly soon after, was instrumental in starting the Church of Scotland. And we'll say a bit more about that in due course. But move forward to the second half of the century. Philip II has taken over in Spain, the son of Charles V. In England, we briefly had Edward after Henry, and then Mary, and then Elizabeth. And Mary had gone Catholic. Elizabeth took England back to being Protestant, and she tried to steer a middle way, so there wasn't the constant Catholic v Protestant. And that eventually was what led to the separatists, as they were called. And what's fascinating about the Mayflower, the Pilgrims, it was two congregations in the north of Nottinghamshire and just into Lincolnshire who formed the core of those who left and separated, and referred to as separatists for the obvious reason. Eventually, they didn't agree with the Church of England's way of doing religion, so they separated. And they went across to Holland, to Leiden in Holland for about a dozen years, mixed experience, and finally 1620 they went across on the Mayflower. And the reason we're talking about this now, well, we started last year, 1620, was the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. Ironically, with COVID, a lot of the celebrations have been held over, so in some ways it's still going on. But why did they go? And here's a painting of the Pilgrims in the 19th century painting. So let's look at this and just read this. And I think this sums up very well what the Reformation was about. It wasn't just a religious thing. It wasn't just a reorder of religion, it was something the social unity, possible to understand without taking a look at the Reformation. And it wasn't just a matter of opinion. It was not It was the very basis of society. Religion was throughout everything. Very interesting sometimes to compare religion these days, and we might come back to that in the questions afterwards. But two key players I mentioned, Luther. So as I said, most of Europe was Roman Catholic then, but it was a real movement for reform. 1517, he nailed up his 95 Theses, protesting. I'd say Calvin became even more influential. And Calvinism was strict. Now, what's interesting, he and Luther advocated execution on adherents. I mean, this was not the sort of nice, easygoing thing. There was, real barbaric times in a way. Talk about Calvinism. And what's interesting, Presbyterianism in Scotland is much stricter than the church in England, that John Knox did. Tend to refer to the term Puritans of those people in England. We'll come back to that as well. So here in England, Henry VIII, he came for almost 40 years. Now, a little twist. Luck plays a part. The twist. He's married to Catherine of Aragon, who is the aunt of Charles V. As I'm sure you all know, she didn't give him a son, so he wanted to divorce her. And the Pope wasn't very happy about that, but sure enough, 1534, Henry split from Rome and England became Protestant. And that also annoyed Charles V because of his aunt, obviously, divorced her. And I mentioned these refugees from the Spanish Netherlands. Henry allowed them to stay, which also annoyed Charles V. Now, he did eventually have a son, Edward, who of course was very young when he became king, only aged 9. So protectors ruled the kingdom, Protestantism spread, and John Knox was actually in the Church of England then. Now, I mentioned these refugees coming across, used the loose term strangers, and of course they spoke either French or Dutch. So in 1550, they set up the first churches with services in their own languages. Now, what was happening in Scotland meantime? Well, going on, as 1517, Luther's books became banned. There's Knox. People think he may even have been the royal chaplain to Edward VI. There's some debate about that. But when Mary became Queen Catholic, he and others fled. So he went down to Geneva with Calvin, very much picked up his ideas. Now, one of the best examples of how to limit your career is, and I'm sure many of you know this, he wrote this document, The Monstrous Regiment of Women, just as Queen Elizabeth became queen. So she was not very happy with this. They said, you're not coming back to the Church of England. So he went back to Scotland, and within a couple of years, the Church of Scotland had been set up very much on a Presbyterian basis. Now, Edward died very young, unfortunately, age 15. So his sister Mary became queen, known as Bloody Mary because of the bloodshed, as she took England to be Catholic again. Another twist. She married Philip II of Spain, the son of Charles V. And if she hadn't died soon after, the King of Spain would have become King of England for a long time, perhaps. But sure enough, she did die. So Elizabeth became queen for the rest of the century. I already hinted, she took England to be Protestant again, tried not to be too extreme to annoy Catholic, Protestant, and so on this middle way. Now, what happened? 1560, just 2 years after she became queen, the Church of Scotland was founded. Key event in Scotland, Mary, Queen of Scots, big story there, but 1587, she's finally beheaded. 1588, the King of Spain, Philip II, again, he sends the Spanish Armada. And if that had succeeded, the King of Spain would have become King of England again, but we all know what happened there. And eventually, it wasn't the King of Spain who became King of England, it was the King of Scotland. As you know, James VI of Scotland became James I of England. And in 1604, he banned private religious meetings, almost certainly the Catholics that said to the separatists, we cannot continue in England, we need to go somewhere else. Gunpowder Plot we all know about, Guy Fawkes, we celebrate every year, a Catholic plot. Religion was a very big factor in those days. Now, so like you, I always wondered how on earth James became king, but quite interesting when you look at the setup here. Henry VII has Henry VIII as his son, and also has daughter Margaret, and she married James IV of Scotland. And they had James V and Mary, Queen of Scots. Meantime, Henry VIII didn't have a son. He had Mary, he had Elizabeth, and finally, he had Edward. So the thing came down there. But of course, when Elizabeth died, she had no children, no boy to succeed. So James VI was the closest to the throne, and he became things. Very interesting here. The age of the kings when they came there. There's James V, only 1 year old. Edward VI, only 9, Mary, 6 days old, and James VI, 1 year old. And you think there's Charles in his 70s and still hasn't got the chance to be king. Anyway, of course, 1603, James I becomes king. Now let's look at the separatists in a bit more detail. So here's a map of the north of Nottinghamshire and just into Lincolnshire. Two congregations, one in Scrooby, the other in Gainsborough, which is just in Lincolnshire. Now, other places were significant. And if you ever get the chance to go there, knowing a bit about the story, I found it absolutely fascinating because the churches are still there and so on. So Austerfield, Babworth, Sturton have a significance. And of course, there were key people. And Clifton was a very powerful preacher down in Babworth, Brewster, Robinson, Bradford. I'll say a bit more about them in a moment. Now, the main reason they left was their differences of opinion with the church. And I'll say a bit more about that in a moment. But they're known as Puritans, strict people. So the ideas grew from about the 1580s to separate. Now, 1593, 3 separatists down in London were executed. And the congregations in Scrooby and Gainsborough had to have secret meetings because of what was happening in James and so on. So let's look at this in more detail. Now, I put this up. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but some of you may be very interested in religion and may know more than me. But the reason the separatists disagreed with the Church of England was these main points. The sacraments of Pope. I mean, Puritans, literally pure and simple in this case. So the sacraments of Pope, there's only 2, baptism and the Lord's Supper. The others, the images of man. Similarly with the hierarchy, keep it simple. We don't need popes and saints and so on. The predestination of marriage, and if you want to, we can come back there. Now, one thing occurred to me way back, their beliefs are more similar to the Church of Scotland than they are to the Church of England. And when they decided to go, I wonder to what extent they said, why don't we go to Scotland rather than Holland? Now, history would have been different, but you may wish to come back on some of that. So here we are, Scrooby and Babworth. Now, Clifton was a very powerful preacher down in Babworth. I mentioned Bradford and Brewster earlier. So William Bradford was a young orphan in 1602 when he met William Brewster, and they used to go 7 miles to hear Clifton. And Brewster, he allowed the separatists to meet in his Scrooby manor. And Clifton was a preacher, and John Robinson, we'll say more about him in a moment. But times got tough when James became king. Brewster and others were imprisoned and fined. Gainsborough was the other congregation. They worshipped in this old Gainsborough Old Hall, owned by William Hickman. Interesting enough, he had a connection with John Knox, but we'll leave that for now. Their preacher was John Smythe, and the authorities cracked down, under James in particular. They were not supposed to be doing this. And they slipped away from Gainsborough in 1607, came to Holland, and that didn't work out as they expected. But the key players here, so William Brewster, he lives at Scrooby Manor. He allowed that congregation to meet there. He went across to Holland, and he went on to go over to Plymouth as well. John Robinson was their pastor. Now, he was down in Norwich, and there were both French and Dutch refugees in Norwich. He would certainly have met them. And people think that may have been the reason why the idea grew, let's go across to Holland. Now, his ideas did not agree with the Church of England, so he was removed from office, went back home to Scrooby, and he became the pastor to the Pilgrims. He took them over to Holland. But when the Mayflower went off, he stayed in Leiden. He actually died there in 1625. And then William Bradford, you can see year of birth, 1590. So he's just a teenager as this is building up. He's an orphan. William Brewster very much took him under his wing. He went across to Holland, and then he went across to Plymouth, and he became the governor for most of the first 30 years. And he wrote this of Plymouth Plantation, part diary, part book. It's the reason we know as much as we do about the Pilgrims and about what happened. Now, basically in 1608, they tried to leave. 1607 tried to leave. They were betrayed. Some of them got captured, put in Boston, ended up in Lincolnshire. It was where they were jailed and so on, but they got out. And the following year, they successfully went across to Holland. They actually first went to Amsterdam for a year. It's only a year later they went to Holland. Now, the reason they went to Holland was that the Dutch Republic had declared independence from the Spanish in 1581. And gradually, what we now know as Holland, those places became more peaceful, such that people could think about going there. Leiden was then the second biggest city in Holland. Now, absolutely nothing to do with this story, but sudden twists. Rembrandt, the artist, was born in Leiden in 1606. He would have known some of the Pilgrims while he was growing up. So nothing to do with the story, but an interesting sideline. So what was it like there? So textiles was the big thing here. So here's people washing skins and grading the wool. Pretty unpleasant work, most of it, pretty poorly paid. So, okay, they're living there, but they're just getting by no means a luxurious existence. So it's 1609 when the separatists arrive with John Robinson. Now, they speak English, of course. I mentioned earlier that the refugees coming to England, they set up churches speaking French and Dutch. No need for Dutch churches in Holland, of course, but there was a French-speaking one, referred to as the Walloon Church, because you may know most of southern Belgium is French-speaking, and the Walloons are the biggest group there. And people coming across, so the English-speaking tended to go to that church rather than the Dutch church. And over the subsequent years, others came. But it was tough. I mentioned they got jobs there, but not very well paid. The children are growing up more Dutch than English, and there'd been a 12-year truce between Holland and Spain that was due to end. So in 1620, the saints, they tend to refer to the religious pilgrims as the saints, as opposed to someone else will talk about, they left for New England on the Mayflower. No, they didn't leave on the Mayflower, they left on another ship called the Speedwell. And we'll say a bit more about that in a moment. So, okay, that's what's happening over in Europe. What about what's happening in the New World? Well, basically, once the New World had been discovered, various European countries set out to try and colonize that. Walter Raleigh, you will know about. He was in Roanoke, brought back the staple part of the Scottish diet, the chop and tobacco, but Roanoke failed. When James became king, he gave permission for colonies to be set up in Virginia. And you may have seen a couple of years ago on television, there's a very good program about Jamestown, but only 20% survived. That failed. So by 1620, there had been no successful colonization of America. Now, the term New England was coined only just a couple of years beforehand. Captain Smith sailed his boat up and down the east coast of what we now know as America, and he called it New England, reminding him of back home. And I'd always assumed Plymouth in Massachusetts was named after Plymouth in England, but no, or because the Pilgrims left there. But no, it reminded Smith of Plymouth back home, and in 1616 he gave the name New Plymouth, just 4 years before the Mayflower arrived. So okay, here we are, 1620 back in Europe. We've got the separatists over in Holland. They haven't got much money. How are they going to pay for this trip? So they did a deal with a company of merchant adventurers in London, who basically saw this as an investment. When invest money, people will send back goods. I mean, beaver skins were very popular then. And you basically will hopefully make a good profit out of this, and hopefully a quick profit. And quite a few of the people who went committed to working so many hours in the fields. And that's where they talk about the strangers. Almost half of the people on the Mayflower weren't religious pilgrims. They were either sponsored by the merchant adventurers or paid their own way. Now, it's been interesting, actually. I've now gone through twice, but 22nd of July, the separatists set out from Holland. The Mayflower set out from London, and the plan was to meet in Southampton. And so I've done this since 2020 and 2021 now. It's quite easy when you talk when we're about halfway through the voyages and so on. But basic aim was to do that. Now, the Speedwell was a disaster from the beginning. It leaked like a sieve on the way over to Southampton, had to have repairs there. It leaked like a sieve, had to go into Dartmouth. They lost another 10 days. And they finally got out about 200 miles beyond Land's End before the sailors said, there's no way we can take this ship across the Atlantic, particularly with the storms and things coming. So they came back into Plymouth. Half of the passengers on the Speedwell went on the Mayflower, make it even more crowded, and half got left behind. But finally, 102 pilgrims set sail in mid-September. Now, just think. You're planning this trip, you're going to go to a new world, you've got no housing there, no food, no harvest, etc. When would you plan to arrive? And you plan to arrive in spring, early summer. They're almost exactly 6 months wrong in time. There must have been strong arguments. Why don't we wait till next year? Well, it's enough. That came kind of, so just company of merchant adventurers, say a bit more about them. So they're investors. You know, there are various livery companies in London. Thomas Weston was the main mover there. So about 40 people invested in this, and they recruited other passengers and basically hoped to make a profit. But I mentioned this, shall we go shopping? Here's Bradford, actually wrote in of Plymouth Plantation. This is the sort of thoughts that went through their mind. And again, I'll let you read that. all great oral actors are accompanied by great difficulties. So they knew there were great difficulties and that needed enterprise and overcome with courage. But the dangers were great, but not desperate. Many, but not invincible. And of course, they're religious people. With the help of God, fortitude and patience must be borne and overcome. And it's intriguing in history. I find those who get up and go, get up and go. They're either very brave or maybe very foolhardy. You can take your pick, but interesting to know what the thinking was going on there. So you've seen the video of the Mayflower, bit of a setup here. So what we've got, if we look here, the poop house, interesting name, isn't it? The master and the senior sailors will be up there. The crew tend to be at the forecastle, and this gun deck, but the lower deck is where the passengers were. So there's 102 passengers. Most of them stayed down there for most of the voyage. They didn't go up on deck very much. The height of the deck was only 5'6", so if you were tall, you couldn't stand up. Pretty crowded. One guy was a shoemaker. He took about 150 pairs of shoes with him. And I think if I was next to him down there, I'd be a bit upset that he was taking more room than he should. But there we are. No technology to tell you where you are. 66 days, 2 months. Just go ahead from now. We're almost at Christmas, aren't we? And finally, 9th of September, someone says, land ahoy. Cape Cod as we now know it, but they're 200 miles off course. So there must be tremendous feelings then. One group of religious saints, the strangers, people saying, we can't land here, we got to land. Well, gosh. Now, just a sort of side issue. It's interesting actually when I've done these talks, people have asked good questions I kind of found out. What did they take on the Mayflower? I would love to know how many days they provided for. I'm sure they didn't provide for 66 days, but the sort of food and drink, they don't know. Again, I'll let you have a look at this, but you didn't drink water then. Water was contaminated. Beer was quite a good solution at Cavite. Of course, they want food that can last. There's no refrigeration in those days. There's no knowledge of fresh fruit. And then obviously bedding and so on. Now, they know there's going to be Indians over there, so they need to be prepared for problems. In fact, Captain Miles Standish went with them as the military leader, pots and pans and tools, because they're going to have to build houses and things, etc. But, I found that quite an interesting thing to think about what it might take. So anyway, I mentioned this. We see land, we've got these two different groups of people. Must have been tremendous arguments, I think. But finally, someone said, look, we've got to live together. We need a blueprint of how we're going to live our lives. And so they drew up this document, which has become known as the Mayflower Compact. So let's look at this in a bit of detail. We covenant to combine ourselves into a civil body politic to enact laws and acts that shall be most meet and convenient for the general good of the colony. So no king or queen, no president, we're going to run this for ourselves. She is a very key early democratic document. So they land, but it's mid-November by this time. They start exploring, but winter hits. They elected John Carver as their governor, but he died the following spring. And William Bradford, who I mentioned earlier, became governor for most of the first 30 years. Now, they got some information from previous migrants about where they might find food in the fields and forests. Of course, there are fish, and there are people. Early December, there was an attack with arrows by the natives. The native tribe were called the Wampanoag. Didn't come to anything, fortunately. Christmas Day, they walked around the corner, and there was an abandoned native village. And the reason was that the Wampanoag had had 3 years of plague. They reckon some 80% of the Wampanoag tribe were wiped out by plague. Ironic in these days of COVID. But the Pilgrims had it tough as well. Disease, almost half of them died in those first few months from disease. Scurvy, say no knowledge about fresh fruit and so on. Starvation, as I say, one wonders how much food they took with them. And they didn't readily have a supply of food when they got there. So the Wampanoag, they were the native tribe to that area. I mentioned there the 3 years of plague, the Great Dying. They were natives, they traded other natives up and down that eastern seaboard. Now, a piece of luck. One day, this Indian walks into camp and he speaks English. And the reason that Squanto spoke English was he'd been captured by an English trader as a slave, come over to Europe. People aren't quite sure if he learned his English in Europe or he was dealing a lot with sailors up in the north, the east coast there, but he spoke English. So as a means of communicating between the Wampanoag and the Pilgrims, and he became the interpreter. So in March 1621, they drew up a treaty between themselves. And of course, the Wampanoag understood the local conditions. So they said, look, survival, you're going to plant corn, you'll need fertilizer. So use dead fish. I don't know if any of you are agronomists or what have you, but apparently this is the way the layers of land are over there. I'll let someone else explore that in more detail. Now, the Mayflower is fascinating. We know the name so well now. It wouldn't have been well known then. No glorious sequel. It hung around for 5 months, so at least the Pilgrims had somewhere to sleep while they were exploring and so on. It wasn't a passenger ship, it was a cargo ship. So even finding that as one of the ships was not a very good plan. But no glorious sequel. The captain died the following year after getting back, and within 3 years there's a report of the Mayflower being in ruins. Even more sobering is this poster. These are the 102 passengers on the Mayflower, arranged in family groups. Those in black are the ones who survived. The rest didn't. So we get the Billingtons. The Billingtons survived, but they were trouble. And John Billington eventually shot and killed someone and was hung. The Hopkins, they survived. And in fact, when Squanto came into camp, he stayed overnight and he stayed with the Hopkins. But look at the rest. Whole families died in those first few months, having had that dreadful voyage. Others, 1 or 2 or more members died. You know, dreadful voyage, dreadful first few months. Now, I put this slide in because it's ironic when we look at the plague that the Wampanoag had and what we have now, and of course, anti-vax, all that comes up. And it got me thinking, I knew a bit about this beforehand. Vaccine, when did vaccines first start? And of course, in Scotland, we're big fans of Alexander Fleming, inventor of penicillin. Now, there's a website that estimates how many lives have been saved by various people. So they reckon Fleming saved 80 million lives, but he's not top. Jenner, the smallpox person, is. And I don't know if you know the story about it. Do you know why it's called vaccination? Jenner was in a rural area and he was talking to one of the farm girls one day. And she said, oh, we're all right. You know, we work with the cows and so on. And vaccination comes from the Latin vax, cow, because they had developed a resistance. And he developed this vaccine. He tried it on himself. He tried it on the 8-year-old son of one of the farm workers who had fever for 2 or 3 days and then survived. But that saved over 500 million people. And you look at the history of vaccines, even pasteurization, even washing your hands, the amount of lives that have been saved. If you're anti-vax, just look at this. There is absolutely no argument whatever that on balance, vaccines have done a phenomenal job for the human race. So there's the Pilgrims. They finally do plant their corn, it grows and all this, and they harvest it. Sure, a lot of you know this. The very first Thanksgiving Day was in 1621. Not just to give thanks for the harvest, but literally for survival. And something I hadn't known until fairly recently, there were 90 Indians at that first Thanksgiving service. The Wampanoag and the Pilgrims got on very well. 3 days of feasting. 1863, Abraham Lincoln declares a national day of Thanksgiving, which you probably know, held on the 4th Thursday in November every year. And I quite like this last line. Americans gather for their feasting, football, and family. And so they set to. They start building houses. 1621, another ship comes out, particularly tradesmen needed to help to make the colonists survive. Another couple of ships in 1623. And that year they divided up the land. Before then they'd farmed it commonly, but then each person got their own piece of land. Now, I mentioned the merchant adventurers. 1626, they bought out the merchant adventurers. 58 of them purchased that and so on. Cattle. And someone asked me, did they take cattle across? I thought, no way. But yes, they did. Not on the Mayflower, but cattle got taken across. They were divided up as well. And gradually what's become known as the Great Migration starts, leading to the first successful colonization, not just by the English, but of course the Spanish, French, Dutch. You know, New York was originally New Amsterdam. French, New Orleans, they've quite a lot, of course, in Canada, still a very strong French faction. Spanish, you look at the names of Florida, Carolina, Virginia, all Spanish type names. So a number of countries are exploring and trying to colonize. And eventually there are 13 colonies up and down the east coast of America. So, okay, let's switch to who went. Now, I mentioned Brewster and Bradford, and I had an ancestor on the Mayflower. Richard Warren, my ancestor, and I'll mention about him in a moment. Quite an interesting map here. Here is where the passengers and the crew came from. And it's interesting because sometimes they don't even know, but where they found out, color coding here, blue is the Pilgrims and the Saints, cluster here around Scrooby and Gainsborough. Green is the paying passengers, the strangers, and the Mayflower came from Harrogate in Essex, and here's the crew down here. Now you look at that. This wasn't even just an English thing. There were no Scots, Welsh or Irish on the Mayflower. Just the south and middle of England, just into Yorkshire, I think was where they came from. And you probably know this, the Americans are very keen to be descended from someone on the Mayflower. I've done a lot of work on this. And I like this first thing. All people are living histories. Our ancestors have lived through history and helped to create it. So they know everyone who was on the ship. Bradford wrote those down. About half have living descendants, and they think they may be 35 million or so descendants. And there's a general society of Mayflower descendants. They write these books which are very well researched. So Richard Warren, I bought a book which gives me 5 generations coming down from Richard. Now, I do family history. Delighted to look at yours if you want. But of course, normally we're trying to go back in time. You know, the joy here is people have come down from there. What we've got to try and do is see if we can get back to the latest generation. And there's societies in every state. There's a society in Europe, and most of the Pilgrims have societies behind that. So Richard Warren, there's a society for him. Now, he was a stranger, so to speak. He was a merchant from London. He'd married 10 years beforehand, had 5 young daughters. He left them behind, little knowing if he would get the other side, let alone if he'd ever see them again. But actually it worked out because he survived. They came over 3 years later, had another couple of sons, and there are probably 1 million descendants. Now, William Bradford wrote about every pilgrim, every one of the people in Plymouth Plantation. So there he is in Richard Bradford's handwriting about Richard Warren. Now, you don't know me well, but I'm a pretty natty dresser, and you can immediately see where I go. Now, I don't know if any of you have been over to Massachusetts, into the hereafter, but they've recreated the 1627 Plymouth Village, and they have actors playing the parts. So I have met my ancestor, and it was fascinating. And so much to say to him, but he knew nothing after 1627, and they're very good. They stay in character. Now, people are very keen to be descended. So in fact, I found none of my family history skills. I've been online. I found I've got some pretty well-known, very distant cousins. Henry Longfellow, the poet. 2 US presidents, Ulysses Grant and Roosevelt. Ernest Hemingway, the writer. Orson Welles, the film producer. Alan Shepard, the astronaut. Richard Gere, the actor. Now, the fact Richard got the looks and I didn't, I think is unfair. That lot I can do about it, isn't there? And now, you know the way the children aren't interested? Well, I got a bit of street cred of late because someone called Taylor Swift is a very distant cousin, the pop singer. It's ironic, you know, I like her music and I watch her videos. She probably doesn't even know that I exist. Ain't life tough? So, moving on from that, I also have an ancestor who was on the following ship, the Fortune, in 1621. And what's particularly interesting about him, literally 95% of the passengers on the first boats were English. But Philip Delano, as his name became, the family was called de Lannoy. They were actually from Flanders, and their story is pretty different. And you may know that Roosevelt was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was a descendant of Philip Delano, who went over, say, in 1621. So if you go back to our map, the de Lannoys lived in Flanders. Flanders was one of the provinces in the Netherlands there. The southern part spoke French, the northern part spoke Dutch. And interestingly enough, they're quite near Lille, which is now in France, but that was about 100 years later. They were then in Flanders. Textiles was a very big feature there. So there they are, the de Lannoys. And I mentioned the Spanish ruled the Netherlands. They were brutal. And so, whereas the English separatists were in a Protestant country, Protestant people where the de Lannoys were persecuted, and eventually they fled across to Canterbury. And instead of going to Leiden first, they came. So they're actually living in England for about a dozen years, while separatism was growing and learning English and so on. And we can say a bit more about that. Now, the Spanish, this is the best painting I've come across to depict the sort of persecution that went on. Peter Bruegel the Elder, some of you know artists, the massacre of the, you're living in a village. The Spanish soldiers arrive. And just look at this. There's so much in this painting. There's the soldiers on the horseback, the soldiers stabbing babies so they don't grow up with the infection. Soldiers guide women into a house. We can only think about that, break into an inn. But you're living day by day with the thought the Spanish soldiers may come and cause this sort of brutality. So the Delanois were in that sort of environment. Now, I mentioned the people coming across, they set up churches, so they're referred to as strangers' churches. So the very first one was in London in 1550. And you can see the colour coding here. Blue is those who spoke French, or were Walloons, Dutch in orange. So in London, there was both, there was a church of each. Others grew up gradually. Norwich had both. Others, Canterbury, I'm going to say a bit about that in a moment. But eventually, mainly, you can see, in the south and the east of England, so these various people come across, and they had the services in their own language. They were obviously in a foreign tongue, but their textile skills, I'll say textile quite a lot here, very key factor in those days. That's something they had to offer. So about 1579, the Delanois and the Mahieux flee from Flanders and come across to Canterbury. Now, I hope most of you have seen Canterbury Cathedral, magnificent building, isn't it? Now, what's interesting in Canterbury, there were refugees down in Sandwich on the Kent coast, and someone came to, they've got textile skills. Why don't we go and try and invite them to come to Canterbury, which they did in 1575, and they set up the church for them. Now, intriguing, the church where they met was in Canterbury Cathedral, in the crypt underneath Canterbury Cathedral is where the refugees worshipped, and they still worship to this day. Now, the Delanois and Mahieux, they're in England, refugees. While they're there, the Spanish Armada is sent. So they've fled from the Spanish, and they're in England when the Spanish Armada comes. If that had worked out, you know, they would have not run or got away from the Spanish. They'd have been caught up again. But anyway, they did. So in about a dozen years, and then they went across to Holland, to Leiden, where, of course, the separatists would go in due course. And intriguing, about a third of the population of Canterbury then was these refugees. Now, say I talked about Leiden. The other thing to mention, so they get to Leiden basically about 18 years before the English separatists come, and they worship at the same church. And I think the English separatists have been delighted to meet some people in this foreign country, foreign speaking country, who spoke English and who actually lived in their country for a number of years. And that's possibly one reason why Philip de Lanright eventually went across to New England. Encapsulate the next 400 years into a couple of minutes, but we know now, USA, 50 states, and so on and so forth. What has been the effect since then? So I mentioned the East Coast, gradually they set up 13 colonies. Color coding is quite interesting in this map. You can see pink is where they got to before 1660, yellow by 1700, green by 1760. Became very much a place of religious freedom. People came from various countries. Trade and commerce developed. Cotton, for instance. Most influential journey in Western history, we could debate that, but certainly we know the USA is the wealthiest country in the world now. Well, let's come back to Scotland. Now, I hadn't realised Nova Scotia. 1620s, Scotland were, exploring in Nova Scotia literally within a year or two after the Mayflower. But that didn't work out very well. They were in Cape Breton, wasn't colonised. East New Jersey, down near New York. So they were there, Stewartstown. So there were various attempts, but they failed. And then I'm sure many of you know about the Darien scheme in Panama in the 1690s, disastrous. Classic example of failed to plan and you plan to fail. And Tom Devine, famous historian, Scotland was one of the poorest countries in Western Europe. Now, I say to people, did you know the Act of Union came out of the Mayflower? Well, it's not the Mayflower, but the successful colonisation that came, because when the Act of Union was proposed in 1707, Scotland signed up very quickly, providing they got access to the English colonial markets. And it was an immediate success. And those of you who know Glasgow, you'll know the famous statue of the Duke of Wellington with his obligatory cone on his head in front of what's now the Gallery of Modern Art. I'm sure many of you know that was one of the tobacco lords' houses, an extravagant Italian building. So immediate success, but then amazing bonus. The Industrial Revolution comes along, and it's been tremendous because Scotland contributed a lot to that, but gained such a lot. In 1850, the United Kingdom had more than 40% of the total world's trade. So most successful economic union in history, and certainly have your views about nationalism and so on, but economically, the United Kingdom has been a big success. And it's interesting when you look at measuring it by the population. Glasgow's population expanded by more than 50 times between 1700 and 1900. And other places, there's Paisley growing. I live quite near Kilmarnock, again, a tremendous growth because of the sort of industries and employment that was attracted by that. And here we are, 400 years on. So, of course, the USA, among the 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, is the USA and the United Kingdom, and Scotland as part of that. Now, those of you growing up in the 1950s may remember we built the Mayflower 2 and in fact gifted it to America, mainly as thanks for their help in World War II. And if any of you have been over to Plymouth there, it's moored there. Now, it's had a major refit. It had 3 years of restoration round in Connecticut. And last August 2020, it set sail under full sail back round to Plymouth. And you can find on the internet, there's some lovely video of it under full sail, quite a moving sight. And of course, celebrations were planned. They started at the end of 2019, were going quite well for a month or two into February 2020. And then, of course, COVID hit. So basically, each place with a connection, either where the pilgrims lived or where the ships went, had celebrations planned. There were TV programs. There was a very good one by Dan Snow last summer. Holland, of course, had celebrations planned, as of course America. And this time, the Wampanoag Indians will be very fully a part of it, whereas in previous, the 300th one were hardly a part at all. But of course, basically, many of these events have had to be put on hold. So just to sort of wind down, how do we know what happened? Well, I've mentioned of Plymouth Plantation. Edward Winslow was one of the early people. He wrote 1622, so he wrote a couple of things. Plymouth settled at Plymouth. Others wrote books. There are records, documents. They kept pretty good records from the beginning of the births and so on and so forth. This painting, by the way, Edward Winslow, is the only known painting of a Mayflower passenger, done quite a few years later. And coming back to Bradford's of Plymouth Plantation that I mentioned, he wrote it that some use may be made in times after. Now, fascinating story. It was passed down the Bradford family, and about the time of the War of Independence, it was in a meeting house in Boston, and it was lost. And it was lost for almost 80 years before, you know, William Wilberforce, the slavery campaigner, his brother Samuel wrote something in 1844 and quoted from it. And someone else read that book and said, that sounds very like of Plymouth Plantation. And they found it in the Bishop of London's library, you know, some 80 years later. And eventually in 1897, it was returned to America. And so as to wind up, quite an emotional thing for Americans. There was a very strong connection with this, as you can probably know. So 1897, this was the speech that was given. I don't think many Americans would gaze upon the book without a little trembling of the lips, a little gathering of mist in the eyes. You know, this is part of their history. These English men and women going out from their homes in beautiful Lincoln and York, wife separated from husband and mother from child, then hurried embarkation for Holland, pursued to the beach by English horsemen, 13 years of exile, the life in Amsterdam, then the dwelling at Leiden, embarkation at Delphi, the farewell of Robinson, who they left behind, terrible voyage, the compact in the harbour, the landing on the rock, the dreadful first winter, the death roll of more than half the number. Of all these things, this is the original record by the hand of our beloved father and founder. And Americans find that very, very emotional, understandably. So thanks very much for listening. Very happy to take any questions that you have. I mentioned I do family history, just in passing, I call it research through people. Some years ago, I was advised make some videos, so lots of videos online. if one of you was to get in touch, I would give you a 10% discount if you mentioned you were from Paisley U3A.